I think we're going to see something happen on the European continent that is going to further inflame things here. It's going to open the door for more violence. It's going to open the door for more protest. It's going to open the door for revolution. So number one, let's work on decentralizing. Take power away from the federal government. Do what we can to make the states more powerful, more sovereign. Number two, let's have a healthy dialogue about whether everyone is better off if California breaks away. Let's have a healthy dialogue about whether we should break up into 4, 5, 6 different nations with good free trade and communal defense agreements. Let's have those discussions so that if that spark comes to light the kindling, we've already covered the topics. We've got this covered. We know what to do. There's no point in trying to burn everything down because we've got a solution.
America is divided because our powerful federal government pits red states against blue. We need to return power to the states and to the people by decentralizing. If that fails, we must be prepared for a peaceful national divorce or face a destructive civil war. Welcome to War, Divorce, or Federalism. America at a Crossroads.
Welcome to War, Divorce, or Federalism, America at a Crossroads. In this episode, I think we will do what I would call a primer, right? What is War, Divorce, and Federalism about? What is the podcast about? What are we discussing? What are we concerned about? So war, divorce, or federalism, those I believe are the three pathways, one of which America will be on and headed toward. Now, arguably, we are already on the road to divorce or war. It doesn't seem like we're making very much progress or headway in the right direction, but the other path would be a more decentralized or federalism type of arrangement with our national government. So the problem is that we are very, very polarized in America. And it's not just America. I mean, take a look at Europe, in England, in France, and actually all throughout Europe. Very, very polarized. Now, in the United States in particular, I believe that this polarization is because we have a strong central government. It's a top-down government. It's a one-size-fits-all government. And that's why we care very, very much. If you're in a deep red state, you care about how much power they have in a blue state rather. And likewise, if you live in a deep blue state, you care very much about what they do and how much power they may have in a red state, because that power transfers on to Washington, D.C., our national government, our federal government. And then because they may have more power, more control in the federal government, that affects us. Why does it affect us? Because the federal government is so powerful. It is far, far beyond what our founders envisioned. So when, say, California is wanting to add more legislative seats in Congress, we care because that increases the vote. That would change things culturally, not to mention just overall policy, fiscal policy, etc. And if you're in a red state, you don't want their ideals, their philosophy, the progressivism. You don't want that if you are a person likely in, say, Wyoming or Texas or North Dakota. Now, again, I'm using broad strokes. Obviously, there are people that think very progressively in deep red states, and there are people that think very conservatively in deep blue states. We know that. But the thing is, imagine that the federal government did not have so much power. Imagine the federal government had extremely little power. We would not care what other states of a different color than our own team, we would not care how much power they would have in DC, because whatever they would accomplish, whatever they would attempt to accomplish, wouldn't affect us. We wouldn't care. And that's the beauty of having a federal system. That's the beauty. Supreme Court Justice Louis Brandeis said something to the effect of the 50 laboratories. Now, we hear about it, 50 laboratories of democracy. That's not actually his quote, but it was 50 laboratories, and he's talking about the states being able to try and figure things out from a policy perspective, the laws they pass, the regulations they pass, what society looks like in a particular state 50 times over. And without adversely affecting other states, you would come up with answers. Is this policy good for the people that live in that state? Is it particularly bad? If indeed the policies that red staters want actually are backwards, would take you back to the 1950s or the Middle Ages or whatever the accusation is, if they were really bad for the people, it would become apparent. And if the left's tendency to socialism, collectivism, Marxism, if all of that tended to be very, very bad for society and the people that live in that state, we would find out. People would move away from any state that enacted laws and policies and regulations that were detrimental. And we wouldn't care. You know, if you live in a deep red state, you could sort of scoff, roll your eyes perhaps at what they're doing in Illinois or New Jersey or California. And likewise, New Jersey, Illinois, California can scoff, roll their eyes, and think of how backwards the folks in Wyoming, North Dakota, and Texas are. But that would be the extent of it. There wouldn't be the need to dehumanize people of a different ideology. Red would not have to dehumanize blue, and blue would not have to dehumanize red, because that's in effect what we are doing. Because it is so critical that we not have people with different ideology, in distinctly different culture, imposing that ideology or culture on us. We don't care so much about what they do if it doesn't affect us. Remember, Thomas Jefferson said, if it neither picks my pocket nor breaks my leg, what care do I have? Now, it was to a specific situation, but I think that generally holds true. We can disagree politely if what the opposing party is suggesting doesn't directly affect us. But when it affects us, when we believe our way of life is at risk, and red state people believe very much that if the progressive blue state people are able to enact what they see as a just society, our way of life, our culture will disappear completely. And the blue state people believe very much that if the red state people fully enact their vision of what society ought to be, that it will be an oppressed society without rights, with tyranny. They believe that very much. If you believe that, you fight to avoid that at all costs. And part of fighting to avoid that is to win, to beat your opponent. Part of beating them, as we have come to, I guess, employ in strategy, is to demean and dehumanize that opponent, because it's easier to, if you vilify them, if you don't consider them human, it's easier to trample them if you don't consider them as fellow human beings with just a different opinion. It's easier to stomp on them, to call them names, to ensure that they are not us. They are not part of the people, the good people. They are on the outside, and therefore they don't deserve the same rights. They don't deserve the same right to be heard, for example. So that's what we're trying to get away from. That is the polarization going on in America. I contend that specifically in the United States, it is largely due to a top-down, one-size-fits-all central government that all of the states are jostling for position, for power, so they control what's happening in the United States, in the federal government in Washington, D.C., that comes down and affects us all. That's the premise I have. That's the thesis, the argument that I have. Recognizing what the problem is. It's polarization, and it comes from, in large part, but not entirely, a strong central government. So then we have our three pathways. This polarization, this strong central government. One of three things is going to happen, in my opinion. Broadly speaking, we could have federalization, federalism, decentralization. Okay, now that is where Again, when I talked about the 50 laboratories, the states doing their own things, the federal government having very little power, the federal government is limited specifically to certain things, but each of the states are considered more sovereign. They can do what they want. That is a federal system. We'll get to that in a second. Path number two, and path number one, by the way, this federal system then takes the temperature down, takes the polarization down. And we can live happily ever after in the United States, as is, with an entirely different arrangement, understanding of what the relationship is of the states to the federal government, with much stronger, much more sovereign states, a much weaker but functional central government, national government, federal government in this case. So that takes the temperature down, we move forward. If we do not federalize, if we do not have a federalist system, decentralized, then we're not going to last as is, as the 50 United States of America. And so then we have to look at national divorce. National divorce effectively means an agreement for select states to break away from the Union, or for the Union of the 50 states to dissolve as we know it and form smaller subnations or smaller unions. We could envision the Pacific states, Washington, Oregon, California. We could envision the Southeast. We can envision the Northeast being separate. We can envision the heartland or the flyover states as being unified. That would be a national divorce. A variation of the concept of national divorce would be secession. You could also just move state lines, and we'll talk about more on that in a second. The thing is, there's a hesitancy, a reluctance to talk about national divorce. It seems unpatriotic. You know, we're all about the United States. And if you are speaking about the dissolution of the United States as we know it, that seems extremely unpatriotic to many. I've seen written the difference, arguably, between the United States and America as an ideal. And some would argue that the United States, where we are at right now, has moved so far away from America, what it means to be American, that if we have a national divorce, we actually regain more of a sense of America. So we're talking the importance of at least being able to have the discussion, because number one, if we have the discussion of national divorce, it brings to the forefront that we have a problem, folks. We have a major problem. If we're discussing it, it's clearly a problem. And if we recognize it's a problem, maybe, just maybe, we could work to decentralize to a federal system, a truly federal system. So I think it's healthy to do that. Not only is it perhaps going to help make it more likely we can be successful at federalism, but if we don't talk about it and the temperature doesn't cool and it boils over, we may suddenly find ourselves in a civil war. Now, people think that is so far-fetched. Now, we're not talking about blue uniforms and red uniforms, and we're not talking necessarily about a federal government, Army, Navy, Marine, Air Force, fighting people in, small towns throughout America. The Civil War can look very, very different, and that's its own discussion as well. So let's get down to those three options. We have number one, federalism. Now, I want to talk about this for just a bit because it's confusing. Because we talk about the federal government. It's like, hey, Rick, you're saying the federal government is the problem. It's too powerful, and yet you want federalism. Well, I don't get it. It is confusing and on many levels. So here's what we're talking about. Think of the federal government as the national government, because a national government is over a nation. Now, we're not typically, truly, technically considered a nation. I know we are considered a nation generally by everyone in the world, but we are a consortium, a republic of states, a federal system of states, a republic. And if we consider it a national government rather than federal government, it starts to make a little more sense. We want to weaken the national government and empower the states. The form of government where there are multiple states that are mainly sovereign and a government over them that is very, very limited, that is a federal system. That's federalism. Okay, so we want that, even though we don't want a stronger federal government. Now, the other part that's confusing, if you go back to the founding and you this discussion that we're having, they had in depth, in detail, impassioned, over and over and over during the founding of our nation, during the discussion of the Constitution, during the ratification process of the Constitution and the creation of the Bill of Rights. So you had Federalists and you had Anti-Federalists. Now, the Federalists wanted a stronger federal government. Because we were moving from a confederation. Before the Constitution, there was a document called the Articles of Confederation. That is where the states really had power. They were effectively 13 individual nations. And then they said, let's come together, not only to fight off England, but we should have a couple of other things. And what the Federalists wanted, they said, hey, wait a minute, let's redo things a bit. And they proposed the Constitution because it gave that federal government, the national sort of government, more power. Now, at the time, it was obviously very, very necessary. They wanted to ensure that there was interstate commerce not impeded, and they wanted to make sure that, and this is probably the primary thing, right after the Revolutionary War, there were a lot of debts, and they couldn't pay the debts, and they needed the federal government to be able to raise money somehow because they had to pay the debts. There's a lot more to the details of that, but the Federalists said, we want a stronger federal government because we have all of these problems. The Anti-Federalists said, no, we don't want that because it's going to have mission creep, and this federal government that you're proposing is going to become effectively like another England. There will be tyranny of a strong, omnipotent government once again, and we want to avoid that. So the Anti-Federalists said, there's no way we're doing this. And they worked out the Bill of Rights to try and ensure that there would not be the mission creep and we would not have a national, powerful government. Now, it turns out that the Anti-Federalists were right. I guess that's the nature of things. Government grows, government grows, government grows. So the Anti-Federalists were absolutely prescient in recognizing the grave concern for this government expanding once they moved to the Constitution. They felt better with the Bill of Rights. They still had reservations. The Constitution overall had a difficulty passing, going back to the states to being ratified. The Federalists, and here again, it's confusing. We're saying that we want a federal system, but the Federalists actually had to be dragged kicking and screaming to accept the Bill of Rights. The Federalists included significantly Alexander Hamilton. He wanted a really strong central government. And what you had were these two factions fighting. Now, I am saying we want a federal system, and yet I'm saying that the Federalists were wrong back in the day. I hope this is starting to make sense. So the Federalists wanted the central government. They recognized that to be functional, there had to be some additional powers for the federal government compared to the Articles of Confederation, because they had all sorts of war debts to pay. You wanted to be sure that someone could sell their wares from one state to another state unimpeded. So there were reasons for that. So there's where we have it. A federal system. We want that to help take the temperature down, to help decrease the polarization, the animosity that we feel, one American to another, depending on what color team. Now, when it comes to the Articles of Confederation versus the Constitution, just a couple of things. The Articles of Confederation had no power to tax individual or goods directly. In the Constitution, they created that power. The Articles of Confederation had no power to regulate interstate or foreign commerce. In the Constitution, they were granted that power. So that tends to make sense. There are several other things, but I would say the two primary things are interstate commerce and the ability to raise money. So that's why we have the Constitution. The Bill of Rights is supposed to protect us, to keep the government weak. You have the 10th Amendment, where anything not enumerated, not specifically listed out in the Constitution as a power of the federal government, is supposed to be very, very clear. If it's not listed out specifically, the federal government doesn't have that power. The states have the power, and or the people have that power. So that's what we're saying. Federal system, we want that. We had Spike Cohen on as a guest some time back, and Spike had a quote that I thought was brilliant. We talked about how with this polarization, with whether it's a Barack Obama, Donald Trump, Joe Biden, all of these figures, Gavin Newsom, we can go on, they increase the temperature. They escalate things. And they escalate things because there's so much power in Washington, D.C. Spike said, decentralization is de-escalation. And I think that is so absolutely true. If you decentralize, if you take power away from that long distant government in Washington, D.C., and you keep it close to home, and you keep those that are in the government that do control things in your society with laws and regulations, you want them to be aware and respectful of the culture that you're in, the culture that you identify with, your way of life. You want that. And it's very hard to get that when you have a distant government. Our founders knew the government that governs best is that which is smallest and closest to the individual. We've talked about federalism. What do you really mean by federalism? Covered that. Now, how do we become a more federal system? How do we decentralize? Now, it can be top down. That seems unlikely. What I'm talking about top down is you have executive orders or you have congressional laws passed that take power away from the federal government, the national government, and leave it with the states. Now, if you think politicians are likely to want to take power away from themselves, I've got a bridge to sell you. So it's very difficult to think that could possibly happen. I mean, it's difficult to get anything to happen in Congress, much less them willingly on a bipartisan level to take power away from themselves and give it to the states, give it back to the states. But we could do things like, first of all, eliminating a lot of the regulatory agencies. That should be done anyway. You could change how we do things where we're sending all of our tax dollars in, and then they waste a bunch on administrative bureaucratic bullcrap and then send it back to the states with all sorts of strings attached. They can take away those strings. They can do more block granting. They can decrease the income tax on all of us federally and concomitantly decrease what they're giving back to the states, allowing the states then, if necessary, to increase state tax to bring in the money that they were getting from the federal government. You see, we could slowly move things around to a more federal system. I think the most likely place we're going to see any movement on decentralization or federalism is from the bottom-up approach. Now, this is an intriguing topic that's really coming up a lot. I hear soft secession. So secession is when a state leaves the Union, at least in this discussion. I hear it's very popular. All of a sudden, it's trending to talk about soft secession. And generally, the people talking about it are people on the left, progressives, Democrats, people in blue states. And of course, they're talking about it more because the people in power are Republicans, alleged conservatives, and people in red states. So they're the ones that are discussing most about soft secession. Now, what they mean by soft secession isn't really secession at all. There's no leaving. They're not leaving at all. What they are doing is talking about a couple of things. One is, you could say, nullification. Nullification is the idea that a state can say this federal law is not a law. It is legal to do what the federal law says is illegal, or vice versa. And that has been made abundantly clear through multiple court rulings in the Supremacy Clause. And so the state can't just say, no, it's legal. For instance, if we talk about marijuana, the states that have decriminalized or actually made marijuana legal, they are not saying specifically that marijuana is legal federally. That's still illegal. And that would be nullification. You're nullifying what the federal government has said. There's other forms of nullification. There's jury nullification. I love this concept where if there's a federal law that you disagree with, that you think is not part of your state ethos, your culture, you could, if you're on a jury, elect to not find someone guilty, even though they may have transgressed what is the federal law. That's jury nullification. It's a very interesting concept. What we're talking about with nullification generally is technically called interposition. This is a great idea. This is what the folks on the left are now talking about with soft secession. And interposition is where you are basically saying, look, we the states cannot tell you, the federal government, that something is or is not legal. But what we can do is say, we disagree and we're not going to help you enforce it. Now, this is most commonly seen with probably three things right off the top of my head here. One is marijuana, as we said. There are numerous states, 20 some, 30, I don't know, states that say that marijuana is legal, even though the federal government still has it as being illegal. Now, they're able to do this because the federal government doesn't have enough people to enforce the law. They could go out and selectively, I guess, find targets or find scapegoats. But the idea is the federal government must rely on state and local resources when it comes to law enforcement to enforce anything. They must. They cannot do it without the state. So if the state says, screw you, we're not following this law, and further, not only are we not actively following it, but we are going to pass a law that says that our state and local officials cannot help you enforce it. You can't get them to enforce the law. If that's the case, it has the effect of nullifying it. Now, I use the term nullification a lot with this. Maybe it's by habit, maybe because that it's a functionally it's the same as nullifying, but you are not. And it's important, I guess, for people who live in a state where there is interposition or where they are saying it's legal in the state, it's important for them to know probably that they are still breaking the law on a federal level. Okay, so that's one, marijuana. Number two, Second Amendment sanctuary states. Now, I was a state legislator. I introduced and got a bill passed in 2021, Second Amendment Preservation Act. Many states passed them. And essentially what it said is, look, we respect the Second Amendment, and any federal regulation that further restricts guns and ammo it's more restrictive than the state law, we are going to interpose. We are not going to enforce it, and we are not going to let our state and local law enforcement enforce it. Okay, let's move to number three. Number three, sanctuary cities. Just as much as the progressives hate the Second Amendment Preservation Acts, the conservatives hate the idea of sanctuary cities for immigration. And what they are saying there in those cities is, look, we can't say that it is legal federally for you to be here, but what we're going to do is not enforce it. We are not going to help ICE. We're not going to help anybody. And because the federal government can't enforce jack squat without the help of state and local, it becomes very effective in a functional nullification, or it's an interposition of the laws that you disagree with. Now, overall, I think this is a beautiful thing. This is a way that states can take back control, and that is with interposition, or what I'll still probably refer to as nullification. The basis for nullification is what's called the Anti-Commandeering Doctrine. So that you should be familiar with the Anti-Commandeering Doctrine. There are a few cases. I brought them here so I can go over accurately, but there are three primary ones. There's New York versus the United States. There is Printz versus the United States. Then there's Murphy versus NCAA. So the Anti-Commandeering Doctrine is a series, this group of Supreme Court rulings, opinions, that says the federal government cannot force legislatures law enforcement, state or local officials to do anything. They can't force them to enforce the federal laws, because that would be commandeering, that would be taking control of these state and local officials, and that is not allowed. Okay. Now, this goes all the way back to Prigg versus Pennsylvania. It was 1842, and it was with the fugitive slave rendition. And this Prigg versus Pennsylvania is not included generally in the opinions that comprise anti-commandeering doctrine, but this is kind of the basis way back in 1842. And what effectively it did is says states could not be compelled to use their officers to enforce the federal scheme of returning slaves. So that's the foundation. Then we go to New York versus the United States. Now, this anti-commandeering doctrine started in the 90s, basically. So 1992, you have New York case. And this was radioactive waste policies. The federal government tried to compel states to regulate the way Congress wanted the states to regulate the low-level radioactive waste. And the Supreme Court says you can't force the states to regulate the way Congress or the way federal regulatory agencies want you to. So that was brilliant, 1992. Then is the biggie Printz versus the United States. And this invalidated the Brady Act. So the Brady Act was a big gun control bill. And in that act, it said that the local law enforcement was required to do federal background checks. And Supreme Court says, no, that's commandeering. You cannot force local or state officials to do your bidding, federal government. So that was great. Then we had Murphy versus NCAA. So you had 1992, you had 1997. That was really the gist of anti-commandeering doctrine. And then you jump up to 2018. 2018 is Murphy versus the NCAA. This one said that that Congress cannot direct state legislators to keep laws on the books. This expanded it to say specifically legislatures. It cannot control state legislatures. So that was good. It expanded it not only from elected officials and law enforcement, but also state legislatures. Those together comprise the anti-commandeering doctrine. There's one more I want to bring in because although it's not technically anti-commandeering, it's anti-coercive. And that's very, very important for what we're talking about. If a state wants to do what they can to interposition, or nullify the effect of federal laws and regulations, it's important to know this. And this is NFIB. I think it's National Federation of Independent Business versus Sebelius. This was in 2012. This was with Barack Obama's Affordable Care Act. And there, with the Affordable Care Act, there was Medicaid expansion. Medicaid is a state and federal sort of agreement. It's a state-run medical insurance. And the federal government contributes money to the states based on a certain percentage. And the Affordable Care Act said, hey, any states that don't do the Medicaid expansion the way we want, we're going to cut your existing Medicaid funds. And the Supreme Court in Sebelius said, no. We are, that is going too far. And so again, that's not anti-commandeering, it's anti-coercion, but it is just as important. It effectively forbade forcing states to administer federal policy by wielding that club of the threat of taking away funding. And that really is how the federal government wields so much power. It's all about funding going back to the states. It's crazy. So there we have the anti-commandeering, which gives the basis for a truly legal and functional way for a bottom-up approach for states to take a little bit more control. Now, when the progressives, the people on the left, the Democrats that are saying soft secession, we're all about this, we're going to form a more perfect union. Now, there are a lot of things that they're claiming that I think that they maybe haven't really thought it through very good. For instance, they're talking about, they love to say how the blue states are contributors and the red states are takers, meaning that blue states send more money to the federal government than they get back, and therefore the red states, which aren't in that situation, are more like welfare states. And the problem is that the federal government gets most of its money from taxes, from people, individual. And the states can't jump in. They've already tried it. It's a brilliant idea. I checked into it. But they can't jump in and say, wait, send it to us first, and then we can be the arbiters of whether we want to send the money on to the federal government. That would be great. That would be really a way to get some state sovereignty. But you can't. It's not allowed. And so there's only so much you can do with this current leftward push for soft secession to form a more perfect union, because you can't control the money the way you want. But you can do some of this other stuff. Now, if we aren't able to decentralize, and I'll tell you, I actually don't think we can. I think we could over the course of, say, 50 years. I mean, you could now. If you had a Javier Milei come in as president and you had a majority in both houses of Congress, also be Javier Milei's. Javier Milei, by the way, is the Argentinian president who came in. He's a free market Austrian economics kind of guy, and he's the guy with the chainsaw that said he was going to slash, but he has slashed, and he's turning the country around amazingly. And it's not so much that I'm saying, although I would want us to get to a free market situation, I'm not even talking about that aspect of it. I'm just talking about someone who is willing to take dramatic steps to get where they think we should be. And Javier did that in Argentina, and that's what it would take in the United States. I don't think we're going to get that. And so to rely on the possibilities we currently have, it's going to take decades. And we don't have decades because we're already at a boiling point. We are not going to become a true federal system on our own anytime soon. So then let's talk about national divorce. There are, I guess you could say there's different levels or variation of what we talk about with national divorce. And Marjorie Taylor Greene brought it up famously a couple of years ago. And now I think I don't know if I want to say walked it back. Either she walked it back or she clarified that I don't think, I would need to clarify this for you or confirm this for you, verify this. I believe what she said is she wasn't actually talking about a divorce, meaning the United States breaking apart. It's curious because national divorce, red states, blue states, I mean, I think that would be the most logical way to interpret what she said. However, I believe what she meant was a divorce from the relationship that the states currently have with the federal government. So she was very much about federalizing, decentralizing, giving the states more power. So that idea of national divorce can really be on many, many different levels. And in the case of what Marjorie Taylor Greene is saying, perhaps national divorce, the way she's saying it, is actually just decentralizing or federalizing. Okay. However, we could start talking about moving state lines. Now, there are movements from, well, really all over. You've got Eastern Oregon wanting to become a part of Idaho. You've got Southern Illinois counties wanting to become part of Indiana. There are movements all around about people that want out of their state. And of course, the reason they want out of their state is because the power center is going to be a large urban area. And the people that want out are going to probably live in more rural, less densely populated counties. And they don't believe that the power structure and the ethos of those in power in a large urban area represent them at all. They feel that they are without a voice. And gerrymandering has helped that a lot, that unfortunately. But they want out. So I think the groups in large part that want to move state lines tend to be conservative or red or Republican. But this could happen. Now, this is something that actually could happen. I believe the way it would work most likely would be if you got the counties to agree, you got the two states to say, hey, we're going to take a look at this. Then you got both state legislatures to say, we're fine with it. You counties want to move, go ahead, be a part of another state. And then it would go to Congress, and then they would need to say, yeah, that's fine. We're going to move the state lines. Okay, that's not a problem. Congress could also admit more states. right? Maybe Trump wants to admit Canada or part of Canada. Alberta has a huge movement to secede from Canada. Maybe they would want to become a state. Greenland, who knows? But next on that sort of level of increasing degrees of divorce would be state secession. You've got many secession movements. New Hampshire, Texas, and California are the most well-known. We've had representatives from Texit, the Texas exit, after you remember Brexit, Britain's exit from the European Union. So there is a Texit and there is a Calexit. And so the idea is that the state should be able to secede from the Union. And that would take, currently the way it's understood, I think it would take a vote in the state, and then it would take Congress to say that's fine. When I say Congress, I think that it would need to go to the states, or perhaps, it depends on the interpretation, perhaps it could just be Congress. Now, here's another area I want to get into. So we talked about federalism, but I also want to talk about this idea of secession, because immediately people are like, you're crazy, you're fringe, lunatic, you can't secede, it's unconstitutional. And I want to argue that point, because it's important to know how ironclad the argument is that you just, period, can't secede. And it's not ironclad in my opinion at all. First off, Mr. Evans, who's in charge of Calexit, pointed out that there's the one Supreme Court ruling, Texas v. White, had as part of its ruling, and this ruling, by the way, is what people point to say you can't secede. But part of the opinion was that it would take agreement by the other states. And so that's the way out in Marcus Ruiz Evans' opinion, the Calexit guy, on, look, if we just get Congress to agree or the other states to agree and we agree, that's all that's necessary. And I think he's correct in that. And his take has been, most of the rest of the United States hates California. California hates, I'm putting words in his mouth, hates the rest of the United States. So let's just part ways amicably. So in that take, it's not unreasonable to think that there could actually be states that vote for this, enough to the point that California can secede. Now, if we go to the guest that I had on, Daniel Miller with Texit, he and I agree very, very much on the problematic nature of the Supreme Court ruling of Texas v. White. So, yes, there was one ruling. It's important for you to know there is nothing said about secession in the Constitution. Nothing. It doesn't say you can't secede. It doesn't say you can secede. It just doesn't say anything. And so, obviously, if it's not prohibited, then you would think that it is possible. But there is one single Supreme Court ruling in which they touched on this, and that is Texas v. White. Now, this was, I'm going to not be 100% accurate, but is roughly 4 years after the Civil War. And Texas had some bonds, and they were federal bonds to the state of Texas. And they were put into play shortly before the Civil War. Texas seceded, or said they seceded. The bonds were sold to various people and then resold and then resold and then sold for pennies on the dollar. And then there was speculation. And then the North won the Civil War, brought Texas back in, not as Texas. I'll have to say, at the time, Texas was really not considered a state. They weren't even represented in Congress. They were sort of lumped together with Louisiana and considered a military district. Nevertheless, the Supreme Court ruled that they had to rule on the bonds and who was owed money and who had rightful ownership of the bonds. And to do that, in part, they had to determine, was Texas a state? At that point, was it a state all along? And that had the effect of saying whether a state could or could not secede. Because if at any point it wasn't a state, then technically it must have seceded. But if it was always a state, then you could say it was always a state because you can't secede. Now, the Supreme Court was made up primarily, the majority was President Lincoln appointees. the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, Salmon Chase, was a Lincoln appointee, but he was also, I believe, the treasurer, or he was heavily involved with the Lincoln administration and money and the North and all of that, and he should have recused himself from this case. Now, with the Lincoln appointees, on the heels of the Civil War, where countless people died, where the country was absolutely torn apart, and then the question comes up to the Supreme Court, how much pressure do you think they had to say you cannot secede? Can you imagine if they said, yeah, you can secede? And then the South would have been like, well, everyone, the North, the South, everyone would have been like, are you shitting me? So we just killed each other by the hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of thousands because states wanted to secede and we said you can't, but now you're telling us they could have all along. There was no way the Supreme Court was going to rule in a way that could be interpreted that it was okay to secede. Now you had justices dissent. I want to go over this. So I've got the ruling, the opinion of the Supreme Court in Texas v. White. And if you'll permit me, I want to just go over it briefly here with you. It's very interesting. This opinion is horrible by Salmon Chase. And one of the things they did was to say, well, in the Articles of Confederation, it said a perpetual union. So therefore, it must be perpetual. I mean, so they're citing a document which we got out of, which inherently proves it was not perpetual, to say that the union is perpetual. And he goes on to say what a state is. And he really does these mental gymnastics, these crazy acrobats to say what a state is. And it's this sort of, it's this people, it's this whatever. Is it a geographic boundary? No, it's, but then he goes back and contradicts himself on that. Yeah, in the opinion, he goes on to say, when therefore Texas became one of the United States, she entered into an indissoluble relation. So that's crazy to think that if you vote to get into it, you can never, ever, ever get out. I mean, think about that. He goes on to say there was no place for reconsideration or revocation except through revolution or through the consent of the states. So there he says, and that goes back to Marcus Ruiz Evans, by consent of the states. So if the other states agree, then you can leave. But he also says through revolution. And he says only those two things can make you not a state, revolution or the consent of the state saying you don't have to be a state. But then elsewhere in his opinion, he uses the phrase revolutionary violence and says Texas conducted revolutionary violence. Therefore, Texas had a revolution. Then he goes on to say, all admit that during this condition of civil war, the rights of the state as a member and her people as citizens of the Union were suspended. The government and citizens of the state, refusing to recognize their constitutional obligations, assumed the character of enemies. So he is saying, we took away the rights of a state because you were enemies. Now, in my opinion, I don't know how you can say that they're still a state. If you said, we're wiping you out, we're taking out the government you elected, we're not letting you be part of the representation in the federal government, and we're suspending all of your rights that are conferred to citizens. That's very, very clear that they were no longer a state. And then there are several places here where he says, we don't have to go into the detail of this or the definition of that or the explanation. It's so crazy. He doesn't want to touch. Salmon Chase, the Chief Justice that rendered this opinion, just sort of leaves things, doesn't want to address it. And then here's one example. He says, whether the action then taken was in all respects warranted by the Constitution, it is not now necessary to determine. So even the actions of the federal government, he recognizes that they may have been unconstitutional, and unconstitutional because they presumed no right to secede and sent federal troops into a state, thereby completely eradicating any concept of state sovereignty. So he recognizes that these things are likely unconstitutional, and he says we don't need to talk about that. And that's what he says over and over and over. Now, let me grab the dissenting opinion. This is beautiful. I hope that you are finding this somewhat interesting, because I absolutely loved it. So you have Salmon Chase, I think the Secretary of the Treasury, a Lincoln appointee, a Supreme Court of majority Lincoln appointees, very shortly after the Civil War, saying that, yeah, it's not constitutional to secede. Like they could have come up with anything else. However, Justice Greer, I think, he says, and I got to read a little bit of this to you. If I regard the truth of history for the last 8 years, I cannot discover the state of Texas as one of these United States. He says, the dissenting justice, is Texas a state now represented by members chosen by the people of that state and received on the floor of Congress? Has she 2 senators to represent her as a state in the Senate of the United States? Has her voice been heard in the late election of president? Is she not now held and governed as a conquered province by military force? The Act of Congress, 1867, declares Texas to be a rebel state and provides for its government until a legal and Republican state government could be legally established. It constituted Louisiana and Texas the 5th military district and made it subject not to civil authority, but to the military authorities of the United States. And so Greer is pointing out you could not do this if Texas was a state. He says, I can only submit to the fact as decided by the political position of the government, and I am not disposed to join in any essay to prove Texas to be a state of the Union when Congress have decided that she is not. So he's saying, I don't even need to prove it. Congress has made it clear Texas is not a state. It is a question of fact, I repeat, and of fact only. Politically, Texas is not a state of this Union. Whether rightfully out of it or not is a question not before the court. So he's not saying whether it was right for Texas to be out. He's saying, look, Texas is out. It's not a state. Having relied upon one fiction, this is beautiful. Having relied upon one fiction, namely that she is a state in the Union, she now relies upon a second one, which she wishes this court to adopt, that she was not a state at all during the 5 years that she was in rebellion. She now sets up the plea of insanity and asks the court to treat all her acts made during the disease as void. I love it. I mean, this is the 1860s, a dissenting Supreme Court justice, and he is pointing out how ridiculous the arguments are that Texas was a state, wasn't a state, is a state, always was a state, isn't a state, and it's just this sort of convoluted mix of whatever it is that can make the case that secession is not legal. He says the ordinance of secession was adopted by the convention on the 18th of February, 1861, submitted to a vote of the people and ratified by an overwhelming majority. I admit this was a very ill-advised measure. So he's not a fan that Texas did this. Texas seceded. Still, it was the sovereign act of a sovereign state. And the verdict on the trial of this question by battle as to her right to secede has been against her. So he's saying basically that the victors get to decide what's what. So there we have Texas v. White. When people are saying you don't even talk about national divorce, you can't secede from the Union, you can secede from the Union. And the only thing holding us back is a Supreme Court opinion, which says you can leave if the other states agree, but is so faulty on its merits in the opinion, the Chief Justice should have recused himself, and it's just flatly a bad opinion. Now, is it constitutional? I think that we can come up with other Supreme Court decisions that allegedly, if anything the Supreme Court says or does is quote unquote constitutional, then what do you say when it's reversed? What do you say about Dred Scott? What do you say about some of the Supreme Court decisions that were clearly faulty? What do you say when a Supreme Court reverses its decision? The Constitution didn't change, but the Supreme Court opinion changed. And this has happened several times. So you can say it's constitutional. I would say perhaps that it is currently viewed by Supreme Court as not being constitutional. However, I think it's constitutional because I have a simple and plain reading of the Constitution, and it's not in there, and it doesn't say it's prohibited. So that is secession, Texas v. White. Now let's talk divorce, actual breakup of the United States. There's a lot of discussion here. I think I'll get back to what I said earlier. I think it's worth considering. What is the American ideal? And what is it for you if you happen to be Republican or conservative, or if you happen to be Democrat or progressive? What does it mean to you? And wouldn't it make more sense if your state had greater sovereignty and if you broke either away from the Union as a seceded state or as a group of states which then broke up into its collective subnations? Wouldn't you be able to fulfill that dream, that vision of America more adequately, more reasonably, more likely? I think you could. And if that's the vision of America, and that's how you get to that vision, to make that a reality, is by changing the political boundaries. Is that necessarily so wrong? I have to ask. Now people say, "Oh, that will weaken you on the national stage," and there's a whole bunch of what ifs, and sure, the unknown is always scary. Always scary. And when you have unknowns that you cannot answer because they are unanswerable, it's difficult to make that argument. But it's very easy to have agreements for common defense. Think of NATO. Think of a NATO on steroids for the nations that come out of the United States as we know it now. An agreement with the Pacific states in the Southeast, the Heartland, and the Northeast, as an example. Also interstate or internation free trade agreements. Nothing says that we can't continue along as an economic powerhouse because we are clear understanding that we benefit by that. Free trade, we benefit by it. Shared responsibility and shared cost for common defense, we benefit from that. People talk about war, and that if a state tries to secede or if the states want to break away, there will be war. I don't think that's true. It certainly doesn't need to be true. And I think that when you are talking about National Guard from various states, those are people that know the other people that they are supposed to subdue, I suppose. And you've got standing armies, but they're limited, extremely limited on what they can do. When Joe Biden talked about, if you want to break away, you better have some, fighter jets and nuclear bombs. That's not how things would go down. I'm not saying there wouldn't be violence. I mean, there's already violence. But the idea that we would get into a blue versus gray uniforms like we did during the previous Civil War, I don't think is necessary at all. I think there's a good argument that can be made that there wouldn't be a war if we can all agree. There's also discussion, and we talked about it for quite a bit with the Collexit and Texit folks, on how do you separate who gets the military bases, the nuclear weapons, how do you divide the debt, what do you do with Social Security? These all can be answered. You can come up with solutions, and I don't think that means we shouldn't talk about it. Because if we don't talk about it, we may find ourselves in civil war. I think that, and I'm hoping to have a guest on very soon, he talks about a civil war. He believes very much that civil war is going to happen in England, in France. It'll spread, and that it could very well be coming to America. And he talks about loss of legitimacy for your government. So what would drive you? What would allow? What would remove the barriers to a civil war? And one is if you do not believe that your government has legitimacy. I mean, that's huge, right? as long as you believe in your federal government, as long as you trust your government and you believe in its legitimacy, there's not going to be civil war as long as the people believe the government is legitimate. I would argue that the vast majority of America does not believe that. All you have to do is look at the approval ratings for Congress. Extremely low. People have no faith in Congress whatsoever. Well, that's the arguably the most powerful branch of U.S. government. At least half the country doesn't have faith in the current president, and the other half of the country didn't have faith in the previous president. So there's very little in the way of legitimacy as far as how we view our government. Now, if you don't think the government is legitimate, it's not such a crazy act to then do something that opposes that government which you find to be illegitimate. The thing that goes along with that is when you believe that your way of life is at risk, when you believe your culture is being taken away, and we talked about this just a bit ago too, whether you're left or right, you have come to believe, especially if you're on social media all the time or you're listening to the news, you have come to believe that the other side are bad, bad, bad people. And they will take away your way of life. Now, unfortunately, because we have such a powerful federal government, they do have a significant effect on your life. But when you believe that your way of life is going to disappear as you know it, your culture is going to disappear as you know it, and the future of your children and grandchildren is going to look bleak because of what the government is doing, or the people in government who are on the other side, the others, they are in charge. If they are going to take away all of those things that you hold dear, and you do not recognize your government as being legitimate, what is to stop an uprising, a civil war? Some people would say we already are in a civil war. It's just not how we typically think of civil wars. Now, there's an aspect to things. When I started this podcast was right after Trump got elected for a second term. And boy, did things kind of cool down, because prior to his election, the folks in red states, the conservatives, the Republicans were up in arms, and they were talking about secession. They were talking about national divorce. They were talking about the need to decrease the power in Washington, D.C. And then Trump won, and in large part, the conservatives, the Republicans, became quiet. But the Democrats, who were previously quiet, suddenly started becoming louder and louder. And so you've got this pendulum. And it seemed to me, and I've brought up a question in my mind and on the podcast, is this pendulum something that will keep us from actually devolving into civil war, actually getting to national divorce? Because one side is hot and angry, and you elect the other side, and suddenly that hot and angry side cools down and the other side gets hot and angry, but they never quite get so angry as to start a civil war. And then by the time they're going to, the pendulum swings, someone else is elected, and they cool down. And we have that then as a history. And there is this bias to think that everything is always going to be normal. And sometimes I've seen memes that says nothing ever happens. And it's sort of like we always get the scares, right? There's going to be some big crash. There's going to be this. There's going to be a takeover. Over and over and over and over, we're told something major is going to happen, and it never seems to happen. It's really the way things seem to happen is the frog boiling in a pot of water. It's super slow to the point that you don't recognize it. And you so gradually allow things to go in a direction you wouldn't normally allow it, also called the Overton window. But you've got this pendulum swing, and you've got a tendency to think things aren't going to change. But here's what I think. That pendulum, whether it's up on the red side or it's up on the blue side, at some point you're going to have the match that lights the kindling. Now, what could that be? It could be another pandemic. It could be something major in the way financially with our debt, losing the global dollar status, the BRICS nations. Maybe it's something with AI. but there's something that's going to be a trigger. And the thing is, because we already have a foundation of not seeing our government as being legitimate in large part, and because we have, whether the pendulum is one way or the other, we have a heightened tension where people are on edge, where people are demanding something that they are not getting. You set off that match, whatever the cause is, whatever that initiating event is, and you may find yourself in a civil war. In that case, I hope that you have made plans to escape to a more rural or at least less populated area, and that you've got some basic supplies. If we don't talk about it, that's how we find ourselves in a situation that we would never imagine. They're called black swan events. And I'm thinking this probably is already covered by someone. It sounds familiar. There's gray swan. A black swan event is something that you could have never imagined, never expected. But there's got to be a name for something that everyone should have expected, but they chose to ignore because they thought it was unlikely. And of course, you only know that in retrospect. So I don't know if that's a gray swan. I don't know if it's a polka dotted swan. But this is a situation that I think that pendulum swing, acting as the boy who cried wolf, because we always cool down, it's always normal. I think that it's escalating. And I think we're going to see something happen on the European continent that is going to further inflame things here. It's going to open the door for more violence. It's going to open the door for more protest. It's going to open the door for revolution. So number one, let's work on decentralizing. Take power away from the federal government. Do what we can to make the states more powerful, more sovereign. Number two, let's have a healthy dialogue about whether everyone is better off if California breaks away. Let's have a healthy dialogue about whether we should break up into 4, 5, 6 different nations with good free trade and communal defense agreements. Let's have those discussions so that if that spark comes to light the kindling, we've already covered the topics. We've got this covered, right? We know what to do. There's no point in trying to burn everything down because we've got a solution. We have a solution in which you, Mr. Progressive, can retain your way of life, or you can further go after the way of life that you envision to be the best, the most just, the fairest. And we have for you, Miss Conservative, protected the possibility for you to retain your culture and your way of life. We've talked this through. You don't need to burn everything down. We don't need to go to war. I think that's worth a discussion. Don't you? That's why we have War, Divorce, or Federalism, America at a Crossroads. This podcast will continue to look into these various topics. I've previously brought in different people to talk about economics and so forth. And although that's not necessarily exciting, it gives a foundation so that we can talk in a common language. That's why I wanted to bring up federalism. What the hell does federalism mean? That's why I brought up Texas v. White. Can you or can't you secede from the United States? That's good to know if you're going to have this discussion. So let's have this discussion. Let's continue on. And I will be providing many more guests with interesting topics. And let's cross our fingers and hope that we can make it through what I think are some tough times coming soon.